Qualche anno fa, mentre si discuteva di candidare Internet al premio Nobel per la pace, dopo che i social network sembravano aver avuto un qualche ruolo nelle primavere arabe, lui pubblicava L'ingenuità della rete. Un saggio che smentisce l'idea secondo cui la rete sia naturalmente portata al progresso sociale e alla democrazia. E nei saggi successivi sugli stessi argomenti ha picchiato ancora più duro, sottolineando sempre gli aspetti controversi di Internet e dei servizi telematici che usiamo tutti i giorni. Il guastafeste di cui vi parlo si chiama Evgeny Morozov, è un sociologo ed è uno degli osservatori più attenti e severi di Internet. È possibile parlare di Internet, di tecnologia, di innovazione, di digitale senza preoccuparsi degli effetti che abbiano sulla società, sull'economia, sulla politica? No, non è possibile.
Per capire la cultura digitale è anche importante ascoltare le sue voci più prestigiose, i filosofi, i pensatori. Oggi ne incontriamo uno, si chiama Evgeny Morozov, è un giornalista, è un sociologo, arriva dalla Bielorussia e il suo pensiero è abbastanza polemico, anzi spesso in maniera molto accesa e polemico contro certo ottimismo digitale. Ecco, lui focalizza l'attenzione su Internet e non trova che Internet sia il luogo della democratizzazione, come spesso è stato detto. Anzi, ci vede spesso violazioni della privacy, sottrazioni di informazioni personali dei privati cittadini, di noi tutti. Ci vede lo strapotere di alcuni gruppi digitali. Ecco, lo sguardo di Morozov è uno sguardo attento, critico, polemico, si diceva, sul capitalismo digitale. Si occupa e si è occupato tanto anche di informazione, di in quali modi l'informazione passa su internet, sui social media, sui social network. Si è occupato di fake news. Ecco, entrare nel pensiero di Morozov significa stare forse con i piedi un po' più piantati nel nostro tempo, con uno spirito critico un po' più desto.
Nel suo libro Internet non salverà il mondo, Morozov se la prende con il concetto di soluzionismo. L'idea secondo cui per ogni problema del mondo esista una soluzione digitale, un'applicazione che può venirci incontro. E negli anni abbiamo scaricato applicazioni che tengono d'occhio il nostro battito cardiaco, l'impatto ecologico delle nostre azioni, il consumo della nostra auto. Ma il problema che volevamo risolvere con queste applicazioni, l'abbiamo poi risolto?
Well, what has been happening over the last few decades is that politicians have found a new way to govern, right? And that's a way that goes beyond the usual mechanisms like laws or norms, and it has to do with enrolling technology and data, right, into shaping our behavior. Very often shaping our behavior preemptively and proactively, to make sure that we actually do things before they become problems, for example, right? So you can actually adjust your everyday life behavior not to develop certain health symptoms and certain diseases instead of getting them and then seeking help, for example, from your hospital, from your insurance company, right? So the fact that data that is now being produced about almost everyday aspect of our life, about every aspect of our everyday life, that data enables that process. So it becomes possible to intervene in what we do because we are always monitored and there is always a screen somewhere in our pocket, in our phone or somewhere else, and it's possible to shape our behavior differently. And the fact that we are now shaping the behavior of people, to me, means that we are focusing mostly on the effects of the problems, so you can actually try to shape the effects of the problems instead of shaping the causes of the problems. So in the case of health, for example, right, it's possible to have us exercise more, it's possible to have us consume healthier food, it's possible to have us make better choices about what we eat and what we don't eat, and all of that is good and fine, but clearly there are bigger structural forces that shape our health, the environment, the pollution, the power of, big food industry, the power of McDonald's. I mean, those are all choices that shape what we eat, what our children eat in schools, and so forth. And my fear is that we are putting these big structural interventions aside, and instead we are focusing on the small behavioral interventions of individual citizens by means of data, technology, and screens.
Grazie alle applicazioni che usiamo quotidianamente, ci sono in giro sempre più dati che ci riguardano. Dati sui nostri gusti, le nostre abitudini, i nostri gusti alimentari, il nostro orientamento politico. Tutta questa quantità di dati ci rende in qualche misura trasparenti, ma possiamo dire lo stesso delle istituzioni e delle aziende private?
Well, one of the most, I think, overlooked phenomena over the last few decades has been what I would call epistemic asymmetry of citizens and institutions, whereby citizens becoming hyper-visible, where there is more and more data about us that's being recorded and analyzed, and there is more and more transparency that's being sort of invading our life, versus institutions who have become less and less transparent because governments can classify information, they can make it less easier to find. Companies actually fund a lot of research that seeks to mislead public opinion about climate change, about the consequences of various corporate activities on the world at large. So it's a very interesting kind of asymmetry whereby we as individuals become more and more visible and easier to control, and the institutions around us become less and less visible and thus less and less accountable and responsible. With all of that put together, I think it's obvious that the power balance has shifted. Right? And it's in reshifting that power balance back to making institutions more transparent, more accountable, maybe a little bit even more open and participatory, that I think a lot of politics, or citizen-led politics, has to focus on. So, and that means that activities like whistleblowing, they have to become easier and not harder. We have to create favorable structural environments, also favorable infrastructures for whistleblowers, for example, to be able to blow the whistle. Right? It means that we need secure technologies, encryption technologies and so forth, through which they can publish documents, through which they can actually get in touch with journalists and so forth. Instead, what we're seeing is the very opposite. We see the criminalization of whistleblowing. We see the ways in which it becomes harder and harder for people to actually blow the whistle. Right? And I think that this is one of the few ways in which we can actually try to restore some of that epistemic asymmetric imbalance that I have been describing.
Secondo Morozov, questa grande mole di dati che ci riguarda è nostra e dovrebbe rimanere tale, cioè dovrebbe rimanere di proprietà del cittadino, del soggetto, della persona, e le grandi aziende per usarla dovrebbero pagare. Questo non succede, non pagano, ma non solo. Ai cittadini rimangono poche occasioni per partecipare a un dibattito che li riguarda e che è invece governato da due forze ben precise.
Well, right now, most of the debates, but also political struggles in the field of technology, they're shaped by two very profound forces. It is the force of techno-nationalism, represented by governments, by nationalists, by those opposed to so-called globalism, so Trump or Steve Bannon, to some extent Nick Farage in the United Kingdom, they represent that wave, and they are very worried, on the one hand, about the influence of digital platforms, but at the same time, they would like to somehow use their own national platforms to advance their own political and economic goals. On the other hand, we have people in Silicon Valley who keep preaching to the world the values and virtues of the global village. So Mark Zuckerberg, who keeps claiming that he is building the next utopia where everybody from whatever nation can talk to each other, and nationalism and borders will eventually go away, they represent this techno-globalist side of the debate. What is missing, I think, are citizens, to make sure that it's not just governments and corporations that are present in the digital landscape. That citizens, citizen associations, citizen groups can also take advantage of the many opportunities that the digital landscape offers.
Parliamo di blockchain. Senza la pretesa di essere esaustivi, diciamo in breve che la blockchain è una specie di archivio dati virtuale, condiviso, consultabile da tutti in qualunque momento. La ragione per cui si è diffusa è che permette di effettuare degli scambi, delle transazioni economiche senza bisogno di un istituto, di una banca centrale che verifichi e controlli che tutto vada bene. È la blockchain stessa a fare da garante. Fin dalla sua introduzione sulla blockchain sono state riversate speranze e aspettative incredibili, come se fosse proprio l'inizio di una nuova era di internet, capace potenzialmente di interessare molti aspetti delle nostre vite, migliorandole. Ma tutte queste speranze, tutte queste aspettative sono davvero giustificate?
Well, like with any technology, there is usually quite a lot of hype about its utopian and emancipatory potential. We've seen it with the internet, we've seen it with the mobile phones, we've seen it even with earlier technologies like cable television in the 70s and 80s. The problem is that in order for that emancipatory potential to be really realized, we need viable and vibrant structures, political ones, economic ones, that could actually turn those promises into reality by creating new sets of rights, by creating new types of infrastructures that would be accessible to everybody as opposed to just select few who can pay for them. And the problem with the blockchain is that despite its early utopian rhetoric and discourse, such infrastructures did not come into existence. We have put too much faith and too much trust in the ability of these algorithmic systems to enforce truth instead of actually building robust democratic institutions that could ensure that these new crypto infrastructures do not just benefit a new type of banks, a new type of fintech ventures, a new type of startups, but also benefit those of us who don't feel the interests represented by the current existing monetary system. So the initial promise that the blockchain will allow us to take on banks and to radically transform the financial economic landscape, it did not unfortunately come true because the banks themselves woke up to the challenges that the blockchain was presenting, and they have managed to twist it in such a way as to actually turn it into an advantage rather than a disadvantage to them. Well, in order to make blockchain more useful to ordinary citizens, we have to think about it as with any technology, as something that requires the right ecosystem and the right set of incentives behind it. So we need to create a new sorts of venture funds, for example, that the public sector can run, that would actually pour money into the development of apps, into the development of services that are meant to boost the civic potential of blockchain and not just boost its commercial applications, which is what, for example, the banks are doing. So unless this pool of money somehow becomes real, we will end up with only a particular set of actors using the blockchain for their own purposes and their own goods. So the first step towards it would be recognizing that something like the blockchain has a political economy behind it, and that a very different political economy will give us a very different blockchain. And once you realize that, like with any infrastructure, the question becomes political. Who is going to pay for it? And in what direction would those funding go? And what kind of ecosystem that might create? This would require, of course, getting our politicians and political parties a little bit more sophisticated when it comes to the digital. They really think that there is just one way to enact this digital agenda, and it's just to follow the lead of the Silicon Valley, of startups somewhere, in Zurich or in Zug or in Switzerland. And that's of course not the case. There are also ways in which the experiences of cities like Barcelona, for example, where blockchains have been used to empower citizens, could also be used to shape a very different digital future. So even presenting this possibility that another digital world is possible and it can be built, I think is a step in the right direction.
In molti pensano che stiamo vivendo l'epoca della post-verità, in cui cioè la verità oggettiva dei fatti non è più sostanziale delle emozioni e delle sensazioni che il loro racconto suscita. Non è un fenomeno nuovo ovviamente, ma la diffusione, la capillarità, la velocità della rete rendono orientarsi ancora più difficile. E allora ci si chiede, nell'epoca del digitale, È possibile ancora distinguere fra vero e verosimile?
Well, I think the current debate about fake news that we've been having for the last 3 years, ever since the election of Donald Trump, it has resulted in a few of us being misled about the nature of our digital condition, if you will. A lot of people think that we are living in the apex, in the highest point of postmodernism, right? We think that there is no single narrative. Instead, narratives proliferate, they get fragmented, there is no coherent story, and digital media somehow amplifies all of that. So it's because of social and digital media and platforms that it has become so difficult for people to actually come up with a coherent account that can hold them together. Hence the filter bubbles, polarization, fake news, and all the problems that we hear about on a regular basis. My critique of this reading of the digital economy is that ultimately we also see a very different process happening simultaneously. And that process is not about post-truth, but about hyper-truth. It's about using mechanisms like the blockchain, but to some extent also like the wiki software that powers Wikipedia, to actually present to the world just one single truth, right? And that one single truth is presented as the ultimate authority that's arrived at in an objective manner. It's arrived at through rational deliberation and by following the bureaucratic rules. So to some extent, it's bureaucracy on steroids that guarantees that all of that conflicting reality can be nicely packaged into this singular package. This, of course, is not how the world works. So there is a lot of, we can say, epistemic violence taking place as these efforts take place. And I think without realizing that many of the players in the digital economy, but especially Facebook, they are caught up between these two competing realities of post-truth on the one hand and hyper-truth on the other. It's very hard to understand why they are so inactive. Because you cannot expect a company like Facebook to be tasked with solving the problem of fake news, which presupposes a minimum of expertise, right? You basically want to have somebody who has to decide whether something that's fake or not be trusted, right? With some kind of epistemic authority, because otherwise, why would they be deciding? In Facebook's own conception of the universe, this notion of expertise does not exist, because ultimately everybody is equal to everybody else, in part because they've spent so much time celebrating this horizontalism, right, when it comes to knowledge production. And so did Wikipedia, by the way, by essentially saying that your contribution as an expert is as valuable as the contribution of any other user as long as you stick to the rules, right? So as long as the rules of Wikipedia are being followed, everyone's contributions are equal. And if you start with that conception of the world, it's very hard to tackle some of the externalities of this digital society. So tackling fake news through expertise becomes almost impossible, which explains why so many of these firms respond to the current task and the current challenge in such a schizophrenic manner.
A questo punto, sul pensiero di Evgeny Morozov, un'idea anche abbastanza chiara ve la siete fatta. Sappiate, se volete approfondire, che tutti i suoi libri sono tradotti in italiano, lingua che il nostro Eugenio padroneggia insieme ad altre 4 o 5. Simone Arcagni ha letto per noi Contro Steve Jobs. Dal titolo e dal tipo avrete capito che non è un ritratto agiografico del fondatore di Apple.
Il libro che vi voglio presentare oggi è ovviamente un libro di Evgeny Morozov. Nella sua quasi sconfinata produzione ne ho scelto uno molto particolare, Contro Steve Jobs, e la dice lunga sull'approccio che ha Morozov nei confronti della Silicon Valley e di uno dei suoi uomini simbolo. Ecco, questo breve saggio uscito per Codice Edizioni va soprattutto contro il culto della personalità di Steve Jobs, ma anche contro la maniera spesso acritica con cui i media, i giornali hanno parlato di questo uomo. Secondo Morozov un abilissimo uomo di marketing e nulla di più.